It was just another quiet morning for Mark, the bakery worker. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft glow over the sleepy town. He opened the bakery doors, the comforting smell of freshly baked bread filling the air. He took a deep breath, savoring the peace that came with the early hours before the rush of customers. It was his routine, his safe space. But as he adjusted the sign outside, something caught his eye, a shadow. At first, he thought it was a group of kids playing near the bakery, just some early risers like himself. But as he took a few steps closer, his heart skipped a beat. There, in front of the bakery, were 4 children standing still, alone, staring at the ground. Mark stopped in his tracks, a chill running down his spine. It wasn't the fact that they were kids, it was the strange, unsettling silence around them. They weren't laughing, running, or playing like children should. They just stood there, like they were waiting for something, or someone. The morning air seemed to grow colder as he approached them, his mind racing. Maybe they were lost? Maybe their parents had just run inside for a moment? But something about the way they stood, so eerily still, felt wrong. Mark could see their faces now. The youngest, a little girl with her hair tangled and dirty, clutched a worn-out doll in her arms. Her eyes were wide and empty, like they had seen something that no child should. The others, slightly older, had the same blank look in their eyes. Mark's feet felt heavy, and his throat tightened as he tried to make sense of the situation. He wanted to call out to them, to ask if they were okay, but the words caught in his throat. Why weren't they saying anything? Why were they all alone at this hour? Where were their parents? The quiet stretched on, the only sound being the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. His instinct was to turn and go back inside, to lock the door and forget he ever saw them. But something stopped him. He couldn't. He had to know what was going on. He took a deep breath and walked closer, trying to force a smile, but his stomach churned with unease. "Hey there," he called gently, his voice shaking just a little. The children didn't respond. They didn't even look up. Mark felt his heartbeat quicken, an overwhelming sense of dread flooding his chest. He knelt down in front of the youngest girl, his hand hovering over her shoulder, but still, she didn't react. He was so close now, so close that he could see the tear-streaked dirt on their faces. His mind raced with questions. Why were they here? What was going on? And then, just as he was about to reach out to the little girl, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. It wasn't just their silence or their stillness that was unsettling. There was something about their clothes, something that didn't add up. The fabric was old, tattered, like something from a time long ago. The girls' shoes were falling apart, and the boys' jackets looked like they had been patched up so many times that the stitching was fraying. It didn't make sense. These weren't clothes that children in this town wore. It was as though they had stepped out of a different time entirely. Mark's hands trembled as he pulled his phone from his pocket, unsure whether to call the police or just run back inside. His thumb hovered over the screen, but before he could do anything, the quiet girl in front of him finally raised her eyes. Her gaze locked with his, and for a moment, everything else around them seemed to disappear. Her eyes weren't just empty, they were hollow, like she was staring right through him. There was no joy, no innocence in them. Only something else. Something he couldn't describe. Mark froze, the weight of her gaze holding him in place. He had seen a lot in his years of working the early shift at the bakery, but nothing like this. But then, before he could react, the other children started to move. Slowly, they began to shift, stepping closer to him. It wasn't like they were walking. It was as if they were gliding, each of their movements slow, deliberate, almost mechanical. And in the silence of the early morning, the sound of their feet scraping against the pavement was the only thing Mark could hear. Just as he took a step back, feeling the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, the little girl holding the doll whispered something so softly, so quietly, that Mark almost didn't hear it. But when he did, his blood ran cold. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mark's breath caught in his throat. "Who's coming?" He opened his mouth to ask, but before he could, the children suddenly turned and started walking away from him, back down the street, still without a word. Mark stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what had just happened. His thoughts raced. He should have followed them. He should have gotten help. But somehow, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. That the children weren't the ones he needed to be afraid of. As the last child turned the corner, disappearing from sight, Mark felt an overwhelming urge to go back inside, to lock the doors and forget everything he had just seen. But the words the little girl had said echoed in his mind. "They're coming." Who were they? What did she mean? And why did it feel like the town itself had just become different? Mark didn't have the answers, but as he turned back toward the bakery, he noticed something else. Something he hadn't seen before. A strange, dark shape, standing at the end of the street, just out of sight. A figure. Watching. Waiting. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as the last remnants of daylight faded. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew one thing for sure: nothing would ever be the same again. What did the children mean by their coming? What was the figure at the end of the street? And what had brought these kids to the bakery that morning? Mark's instincts told him to run, to leave town and never look back. But something, deep inside, told him he was about to uncover a secret far darker than he could ever imagine. And this was only the beginning. Mark stood at the bakery door, staring into the empty street where the children had disappeared. The silence pressed in on him, thick and suffocating. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He had always known the town to be quiet, maybe too quiet at times, but this was different. Something felt off. The strange feeling that had settled in his gut wouldn't let go. As he stepped back into the bakery, the familiar warmth of the ovens didn't offer the comfort it once did. His thoughts were still on the children, their strange appearance, their hollow eyes, the eerie silence they carried with them. And most of all, those words the little girl had whispered. "They're coming." Who were they? What did she mean? Mark tried to focus on the task at hand, arranging loaves of bread on the counter, preparing for the morning rush. But no matter how hard he tried to push the thoughts away, they lingered in his mind like a shadow. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was on its way, something he wasn't prepared for. He'd lived here all his life, and in all those years, he had never encountered anything like this. The door to the bakery jingled, pulling Mark out of his thoughts. He looked up, relieved for the distraction, but his relief quickly faded when he saw who walked in. It was Sarah, one of the regulars, a woman in her late 30s with a warm smile and a friendly demeanor. She greeted Mark with a nod as she always did, but today, there was something different in her eyes, something guarded, like she was hiding something. "Morning, Mark," Sarah said, her voice just a little too quiet, a little too tense. "Busy day ahead?" "Same as usual," Mark replied, trying to keep his tone casual, though he was far from feeling normal. He couldn't get the image of those children out of his mind. Sarah's eyes darted toward the window, looking outside for a moment before she looked back at Mark. There was a flicker of something in her gaze, fear? Hesitation? It was hard to say. She didn't look like the woman who came in for her daily loaf of sourdough. "Did you happen to see anything unusual this morning?" Sarah asked, her voice dropping lower, as though she was afraid someone might overhear. Mark froze. The question caught him off guard. It wasn't like Sarah to be so cryptic. "Like what?" he asked, trying to sound casual, but inside, his stomach tightened. I don't know," Sarah muttered, glancing around again as if to make sure no one else was listening. "I've been hearing strange things lately. People in town, they're talking about it. About the children." Mark's heart skipped a beat. "What about the children?" Sarah lowered her voice even further, leaning in so close he could smell the faint scent of lavender on her clothes. "I don't know if you've noticed, but there's been a strange presence in town. People have seen them, those 4 kids. They've been showing up in different places, standing still, just like you described. And then, they disappear. No one knows where they go, or who they are, but I swear, every time I hear about it, I get this sinking feeling in my stomach." Mark's breath hitched. "You've seen them?" She shook her head, her expression tight. "No, but I've heard the stories. And I'm telling you, something's wrong. People are getting nervous. Last night, a friend of mine swore she saw one of them near the old church. Just standing there, staring at her window." She shuddered. "It's like they're watching us. And there's something about them. It's not just that they're kids. It's like they don't belong here. Like they've come from somewhere else." Mark's mind raced. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, but they made no sense. "What do you mean, somewhere else?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah took a deep breath, her eyes darting nervously toward the door. "I don't know, Mark. But something's happening. People are talking about strange occurrences in town, things that don't make sense. The lights flickering at night, animals acting strange, people feeling like they're being watched. And it all started around the time those kids showed up. It's like they're a warning, or a sign. I don't know what it is, but it doesn't feel right." Mark's head was spinning. Was this all just coincidence, or was there something deeper going on? He had lived in this town all his life, and it had always been a peaceful place, quiet, slow-paced, nothing ever out of the ordinary. But now, everything felt different. The air was thick with tension, like something was about to snap. As Sarah grabbed her loaf of bread and headed toward the door, she stopped and turned to Mark, her eyes wide with a sudden intensity. "You need to be careful," she said, her voice barely audible. "The kids, they're not just kids. And the figure you saw, standing at the end of the street, you're not the only one who's seen it." Before Mark could ask her anything else, Sarah hurried out the door, leaving him standing there, his mind reeling. Not the only one who had seen it. That meant other people had noticed the figure too. What was it? Was it connected to the children? Mark's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the bell above the bakery door ringing again. This time, it was Tom, another local, with a hurried expression on his face. He was sweating, his clothes disheveled, like he had just run here. "Mark," Tom said, his voice urgent. "You gotta come with me. It's happening." Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he followed Tom outside, the cool morning air hitting his face. "Tom, what's going on?" Mark asked, but Tom didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced around nervously, making sure no one else was watching. Then, he leaned in close and whispered, "I saw it. The figure. Last night. Standing in the woods near the old church. Just like Sarah said. But it wasn't just standing there. It was watching. And I swear, when it turned toward me, it felt like it was looking straight through me. Like it knew who I was. Like it was waiting for something. Waiting for the right time." Mark's blood ran cold. The pieces were starting to fit together, but the picture they formed was one he didn't want to see. "Who is it, Tom? What is it?" Mark asked, his voice tight with fear. Tom looked over his shoulder, his face pale. "I don't know, man. But whatever it is, it's connected to those kids. And whatever's coming, it's coming for all of us." Mark felt his heart race as he looked down the empty street, where the first signs of dawn were just starting to light up the horizon. It had all started with those 4 abandoned children. Now, the entire town seemed to be on edge, as though something invisible was creeping closer. Something ancient, something that shouldn't be here. He didn't know what was about to happen, but he knew one thing for sure: the strange happenings, the whispers, and the warnings, everything was connected. And Mark was in the middle of it all. But just as he was about to ask Tom more questions, a strange sound interrupted them, a low, distant hum, like a buzzing that seemed to come from the very ground beneath their feet. It was faint at first, but it grew louder and louder, until it felt like the entire town was vibrating with it. Mark's heart thudded in his chest as he turned toward the source of the sound, his eyes scanning the horizon. And then, in the distance, he saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the woods. Waiting. The air around them seemed to grow heavier, as if the world was holding its breath. Mark's body tensed, every instinct screaming at him to run, to get as far away as possible. But his feet were frozen to the ground, as though the figure's presence was pulling him toward it. Something was coming. Something was waking up. And no one in the town was ready for what was about to unfold. The figure standing at the edge of the woods wasn't just any person. It didn't move like a human. There was something unnatural about it, something unsettling that made Mark's heart race in his chest. The more he stared, the more it felt as though the figure was aware of him, aware of his every breath, his every movement. Mark's pulse quickened as the distant hum continued, growing louder by the second, and yet the figure stood motionless, like a shadow cast by the earth itself. He couldn't look away. "Tom," Mark's voice came out in a hoarse whisper. "Do you see that?" Tom nodded but didn't speak. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. He didn't seem to know what to do either. For a moment, the two of them just stood there, staring at the woods, the buzzing sound vibrating through the air, the ground beneath them almost pulsing with the noise. Mark swallowed hard, his mind racing with a million questions. What was this figure? Why was it there? And how was it connected to the strange events unfolding in the town? The children. The whispering girl. The sudden chill in the air. The figure in the woods. It was all connected, but the connections didn't make sense. They were fragments of something bigger, a puzzle that he couldn't quite fit together. But one thing was clear: something was coming, and it wasn't friendly. Mark could feel his instincts screaming at him to run, to leave before whatever it was could get any closer. But he couldn't tear his eyes away from the figure. It was almost as though it was waiting for him to make the first move, as if it knew something he didn't. His legs felt like lead, and his mouth went dry. It was as though the world around him had frozen in place. Time itself had slowed down. "Mark," Tom whispered, his voice shaking. "We need to get out of here. Now." Tom's words snapped Mark out of his trance, but the fear in his friend's voice only made his stomach twist even tighter. Mark nodded, not trusting his voice. Slowly, cautiously, they began to back away, step by step, as if any sudden movement might provoke the figure. But with each step they took, the buzzing grew louder, the air heavier. The figure didn't move, but its presence felt suffocating. It was as if it had control over the very space around them. The quiet street behind them seemed impossibly distant, the bakery just a small speck in the background. The sense of isolation was overwhelming. Mark's breath came in short bursts as he and Tom turned, both of them now walking briskly toward the bakery. But just as they reached the door, Mark's gaze shot back toward the woods. The figure was still there, unmoving, watching. They rushed inside, locking the door behind them, though neither of them felt any safer. The bakery's familiar warmth did nothing to calm the cold terror that gripped Mark's chest. He could still hear the buzzing in his ears, still feel the weight of that gaze, like it was pressing down on him from all directions. Tom sank onto one of the stools at the counter, running his hands through his hair in agitation. Mark, unable to sit still, paced in front of the window, peering out nervously. It was just the two of them in the bakery now, but Mark could have sworn he saw a shadow moving in the corner of his eye. He spun around, but the shadow was gone. "Do you think it's one of the children?" Tom asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes darted nervously to the door, as if the figure might somehow break through the walls. "I don't know," Mark replied, shaking his head. "But whatever it is, it's connected. The kids, the figure in the woods, the way people are acting. It's all tied together." Tom looked up at him, his brow furrowed. "But how? What does it want? What are we supposed to do?" Mark paused. He didn't have an answer. The words they're coming echoed in his mind. The little girl's whisper. The strange way she had said it. It was as if she knew something that Mark couldn't possibly understand. He glanced out the window again, the figure still standing in the woods, just at the edge of his vision. He couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just waiting. It was preparing for something. Something that would change everything. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The bakery, once a place of comfort and routine, now felt suffocating, as if the walls were closing in around them. The buzzing noise that had been in the air earlier was still faintly present, like a distant hum that wouldn't go away. Mark's thoughts were jumbled, but one thing was clear: he couldn't ignore it. He couldn't pretend nothing was happening. The door to the bakery opened again, and Mark's head whipped around, his heart leaping in his chest. But it wasn't anyone he knew, just an old man, hunched over with a cane, wearing a long coat despite the warmth of the morning. He stepped inside without a word, his eyes scanning the room as though he knew exactly where to look. The man's presence seemed to bring a strange calm with it, a silence that made Mark uneasy. He felt like the stranger's gaze was too knowing, too deliberate. The man didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, watching Mark and Tom closely, before his eyes finally settled on the window. Without a word, he took a step toward the counter, settling into a seat with a quiet grunt. Mark exchanged a glance with Tom, both of them confused. It wasn't often that anyone came in here looking so out of place, and the man's demeanor was unsettling, as though he was waiting for something to happen. Then, the old man spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "You've seen them, haven't you?" Mark's breath caught in his throat. "Seen who?" he asked, his voice coming out too sharp. The man didn't answer directly. Instead, he gave a slow, deliberate nod, as if he had already anticipated the question. "The children. And the figure. You've seen it, too. You're not the only ones." He paused, his eyes shifting between Mark and Tom. "You should have stayed away. All of you should have." Mark's stomach twisted. There was a sense of knowing in the man's words, something unsettlingly familiar, as though he had seen this happen before. "What are you talking about?" Mark asked, his voice trembling now. The old man leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Mark's. "You think it's just coincidence? The kid showing up out of nowhere? The figure in the woods? It's not. They've been waiting. Watching. And now, the time has come." Mark's mind raced. What did the man mean? What had been waiting? He opened his mouth to ask more, but the man raised a hand, silencing him. "You'll find out soon enough," he said, his voice carrying an eerie calm. "You've already felt it, haven't you? The town's not the same anymore. Something's waking up, and it's not just the children or the figure. It's everything. The land, the people, the darkness beneath it all. It's all connected." The bakery, once a place of warmth and comfort, now felt like a trap, its walls closing in on Mark with each word the old man spoke. He wanted to understand, to ask more, but the man's presence made it feel like there was no way out. "Get out while you still can," the old man said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's coming for all of you. And when it does, there won't be any escaping." Mark stood frozen, the weight of the man's words heavy in the air. Something was coming. And the town, his town, was already changing, becoming something darker, something twisted. There was no going back now. The old man's words echoed in Mark's head, drowning out the soft hum that continued to vibrate in the air. Something was waking up. Something connected to the children, the figure, and the strange happenings around the town. It felt as though the very ground beneath his feet had shifted, and the town he thought he knew so well had become something unfamiliar, even hostile. Mark's heart was racing as he looked over at Tom. His friend looked just as shaken, but there was something else in his eyes, a flicker of understanding, as if the old man's words had triggered something deep within him. But before Mark could ask, Tom spoke, his voice shaky but urgent. "We need to find out what's going on. We can't just sit here and wait for whatever's coming." Mark nodded, his mind still swirling with confusion. He knew Tom was right. They couldn't sit idly by and let the mystery unfold without trying to understand it. But where could they start? The old man's warning echoed in his mind. The time has come. What did that mean? What was supposed to happen? And how were the children connected to it all? The figure in the woods seemed to hold the key to everything. It wasn't just standing there. It was waiting. And it wasn't just any figure, it felt wrong, as if it wasn't part of the world they knew. Mark's instincts told him that whatever it was tied to the land, the town, maybe even something older than anyone could understand. He turned back to the old man, who was now staring out the window, his eyes distant, lost in thought. The buzzing noise in the air had started to fade, but the tension remained, thick and suffocating. It was as if the very air was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. "What do you know about the children?" Mark asked, his voice low but insistent. The old man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he slowly turned his head toward Mark, his gaze sharp, like he had been waiting for that question. "They're not like other children," the old man said slowly, his voice a gravelly whisper. "They've been here before, and they'll come again. People think they're lost, abandoned. But they're not. They're here for a reason. And that reason," he paused, as if the words themselves were too dangerous to speak. "It's something that's been buried for a long time. Something the town forgot. But it's waking up now, and those children, they're the ones who can bring it all back." Mark felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The old man's words were cryptic, but they felt heavy, like they carried a terrible truth. He had always thought of the town as a safe, ordinary place, a place where things never truly changed. But now, everything felt different. It was like the town itself was a puzzle, and they had just uncovered a piece, only, they didn't know what the picture would look like. "The figure," Mark began, but he didn't know how to ask. What was it? Who was it? What did it want? The old man leaned in closer, his voice barely a whisper. "That's what you need to understand. The figure, the children, they're the signs. The figure is the watcher. It's the one who waits. It's been here for a long time, and when it shows itself, when it finally comes out of the woods, that's when the cycle will begin again." Tom was shaking his head, trying to make sense of it all. A cycle? What cycle? What happens when it begins? The old man's eyes darkened. When the cycle begins, the town will change. People will change. The land will change. It's not just a physical thing, it's something deeper. It's tied to the very core of this place. And once it starts, it won't stop until everything is different. Mark felt the weight of the old man's words settle over him like a dark cloud. Different? Different how? The old man's gaze flickered toward the window again, and Mark followed his eyes. The figure was still there, just on the edge of the woods, unmoving, but somehow Mark felt its presence more acutely than before. It wasn't just standing anymore. It was waiting. And Mark felt the pull of it deep in his gut, as though it was calling to him, urging him to understand, to step closer, to embrace whatever it was. It's not just the figure, the old man continued, his voice a low murmur. It's the land. The woods. The air. The ground beneath your feet. There's something beneath all of this. Something ancient. And those children, they're not lost. They're here because they must be. They're here to wake up what's sleeping beneath. Mark was silent, his mind racing. He had always thought of the town as a peaceful, almost boring place. But now, he could feel something shifting beneath the surface. It was as if the town itself had been lying in wait for something to stir it from its slumber. And the children, their haunting, silent presence, seemed to be the key to whatever was about to unfold. Tom seemed to understand the gravity of the situation as well, though he still seemed unsure of what to do. He looked at Mark, his eyes pleading for answers that neither of them had. "What are we supposed to do now?" Tom asked, his voice trembling with fear. The old man leaned back, his expression grim. "There's nothing you can do. Not yet. But you'll know when the time comes. You'll feel it. The air will change. The ground will tremble. And when the children are ready, when the figure moves, you'll be there. The town will be changed forever." Mark didn't know what to say. He couldn't process everything that was happening, and yet, some part of him knew that the old man's words were true. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, that strange, unsettled feeling that something terrible was coming. And yet, no one seemed to know exactly what it was. He glanced at Tom, whose face was pale, his hands gripping the edge of the counter. Tom was scared, just like Mark. But they couldn't run. They couldn't just leave. Something was forcing them to stay, something they couldn't escape, no matter how hard they tried. The children. The figure. The land. The cycle. It was all connected, and Mark had a sinking feeling that there was no way out. The old man stood up slowly, his joints creaking as he did. "Be careful, both of you," he said, his voice low and weary. "This town's secrets are more than just stories. They're real. And when they come for you, you won't be able to hide." Mark's heart pounded in his chest as the man walked out of the bakery, leaving them in a silence that felt too heavy. The buzzing sound had faded, but the unease, the sense of something wrong, still hung in the air. Mark looked at Tom again. Neither of them said anything, but the weight of the moment was undeniable. They were standing on the precipice of something they didn't understand, something dark and powerful. The children were just the beginning. The old man's departure left a heavy silence in the bakery, and Mark found himself staring at the door long after it had closed. The weight of his words still hung in the air, suffocating in its intensity. Tom was pacing now, his steps quick and erratic, as if he couldn't settle into the new reality that had been thrust upon them. Mark's mind raced with questions, none of which seemed to have an answer. "What do you think he meant by the cycle?" Tom asked, his voice low and strained. Mark could only shake his head. He didn't know. There was no way to explain the strange feeling that had crept into his chest, that gnawing sensation that something was shifting beneath them. He couldn't make sense of the old man's cryptic warning, nor the connection between the figure in the woods, the children, and the strange things happening in town. But one thing was clear, they were all part of something larger. And it wasn't something they could ignore. The bakery had always been a refuge, a place where Mark and Tom could escape the noise and chaos of the world. But now, it felt like a cage. The same walls that had once provided comfort now felt suffocating. The windows seemed too small, as if they were trapped inside with the darkness that lurked just outside. Mark glanced outside once more. The figure was still there, standing at the edge of the woods, unmoving. There was something about its stillness that was unnerving. It wasn't just waiting, it was watching. But Mark couldn't bring himself to go out there. Not yet. There were too many questions he didn't have answers to, too many pieces of the puzzle that didn't fit. Tom stopped pacing and looked at him, his face pale. We can't just do nothing. If what that guy said is true, then we need to find out more. We can't wait for whatever it is to come to us. Mark nodded slowly. He agreed. But where did they start? What could they possibly do against whatever force was stirring in the town? The children had appeared out of nowhere, and that eerie hum had only grown louder in the last few days. And now, there was this figure, waiting, watching, waiting for the right moment. It was all connected, but Mark couldn't make sense of the bigger picture. There was a knock at the door, sharp and insistent. Mark jumped, his heart leaping in his chest. He wasn't expecting anyone, and the sudden interruption sent a shiver down his spine. Tom took a step back, his face a mirror of Mark's own shock. Mark hesitated, but something inside him urged him to answer. With a cautious step, he walked over to the door, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for the handle. He took a deep breath and opened it. It was the little girl. The one from the street earlier, the one who had whispered to him, her wide eyes filled with that strange, unsettling knowing. She was standing there now, staring up at him, her small hands clutching something to her chest. Her expression was unreadable, but Mark could see the fear in her eyes. She looked different now, darker, almost as if she carried the weight of something beyond her years. What is it? Mark asked, his voice a little rougher than he intended. The girl didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped forward, her gaze flicking nervously toward the woods behind the bakery. Mark's eyes followed hers, but the figure was no longer visible. It was as if it had melted back into the trees, disappearing without a trace. I need help, the girl whispered, her voice small, barely audible. They're coming for me. Mark's stomach twisted. Who's coming? What do you mean? She looked up at him, her eyes wide and desperate. The ones in the woods. They want me to come with them. They want all of us. But I can't, her voice trailed off, and she clutched whatever she was holding to her chest even tighter. I don't want to go. Mark's pulse quickened. The woods. The figure. The children. It was all connected, but it didn't make sense. You've seen them? The ones in the woods? The girl nodded, her eyes darkening with fear. They're not normal. They're not like us. They've been waiting, but now it's time. She glanced over her shoulder again, her small body trembling. They're coming. Before Mark could ask another question, the girl stepped back, her small form retreating toward the street. She hesitated for a moment, then looked back at him, her voice barely a whisper. They don't like it when people interfere. And with that, she turned and disappeared into the shadows of the street. Mark stood frozen, his mind reeling. Tom was at his side now, looking just as stunned. Neither of them spoke for a moment, the weight of the girl's words settling over them like a heavy fog. They don't like it when people interfere. What did that mean? Who were they? And why did the girl seem so frightened? Mark's thoughts were interrupted by a low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth. It was faint at first, but it grew louder with each passing second, the ground beneath his feet vibrating in a way that felt unnatural. It was the same hum he had heard before, only this time, it was more intense, like the very fabric of the town was shifting. Tom looked around, his eyes wide. What's happening? Mark didn't know how to answer. He could feel the air thickening, pressing in on him from all sides. There was something happening in the town, something that couldn't be ignored any longer. It was as if the veil between their world and something darker, something more sinister, was thinning. And soon, there would be no stopping it. Suddenly, the ground shook beneath them, more violently now. Mark stumbled, grabbing onto the counter for support as the bakery seemed to groan with the force of the tremor. The buzzing sound was deafening now, a constant hum that made his teeth ache and his bones vibrate. "What the hell is going on?" Tom shouted, his voice barely audible over the noise. Mark didn't have an answer. He couldn't even think. His heart was pounding in his chest as the tremors grew more intense. And then, through the fog of confusion and fear, he heard it. A distant, guttural sound, like the howling of wind, or perhaps something else entirely. It was a sound unlike anything he had ever heard before. "Mark!" Tom's voice broke through his haze of panic. "We need to get out of here. It's happening." Mark's mind raced, his thoughts scattered and disjointed. There was no safe place to run. The town was changing, warping around them. The cycle that the old man had warned about, it was beginning. And it was happening faster than Mark had ever imagined. Before he could even process the magnitude of it all, the bakery door flew open, crashing against the wall with a force that sent a jolt through Mark's body. And there, standing in the doorway, was the figure. Mark's breath caught in his throat. It had come for them. The cycle was beginning, and there was no turning back now. The figure in the doorway was unlike anything Mark had ever seen. It wasn't a man, or even a human at all, really. The shape was tall and vague, obscured by an almost tangible shadow that made it difficult to focus on its features. It was like looking at a dark silhouette, one that flickered in and out of clarity, as if the figure was not truly part of this world. Its presence radiated a strange, unsettling cold, and the air around it seemed to bend, as if the very space itself was warping under its weight. Mark could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the sound deafening in his ears. He wanted to move, to run, but his feet were frozen to the floor, trapped by an unseen force. Tom was beside him, equally motionless, staring wide-eyed at the figure that had appeared out of nowhere. The buzzing noise was louder now, almost a physical thing, pressing against their ears, rattling their teeth. The figure didn't step inside. It simply stood there, watching them. Its presence seemed to stretch, filling the doorway, filling the room, as if the whole world was suddenly aware of its existence. And then, with a voice like the creak of an ancient door, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come," it said, its voice deep and distorted, as though it was speaking through layers of time. The words vibrated in Mark's chest, like a low hum that seemed to resonate within his very bones. "But now that you are here, there's no turning back." Mark swallowed hard, his mouth dry, but the words seemed to stick in his throat. He couldn't respond. The weight of the figure's presence pressed down on him, suffocating him with a sense of inevitability. It wasn't just standing there, it belonged there, as though the very ground around it had been made for its existence. "What do you want?" Tom managed to croak, his voice strained and small. The figure didn't move. Its form wavered, like smoke caught in the wind, and then it seemed to flicker again, more sharply this time. Mark thought he saw something like a face, but it was indistinct, a blur of shadow and light that seemed to shift every time he tried to focus on it. But then it was gone, swallowed by the darkness of its own form. "You don't understand," the figure said, its voice lowering to a whisper that seemed to reverberate in the air. "This town, it was never meant to be what you think it is. And the children," it paused, as if savoring the word, "the children are not like you. They are not lost, nor abandoned. They are chosen." Mark's chest tightened at the mention of the children. He thought back to the girl, the one who had appeared at the bakery earlier, and the strange, terrified look in her eyes. She had known something. She had seen something. But she hadn't been able to explain it. Now, Mark was starting to understand that the children were not mere victims. They were part of something much larger. They were being pulled into something that had been brewing for far longer than Mark could comprehend. Chosen for what? Mark finally managed to force the words out. The figure's form seemed to grow more solid, the shadows shifting and undulating around it like living things. It took a step forward, and Mark felt the air grow colder still. Chosen to awaken what lies beneath, it said, each word dripping with a dark finality. The cycle must continue. The land calls. The time has come. Mark's breath caught in his throat. The land calls, the old man's warning echoed in his mind. The town's secrets are more than just stories. They're real. The hum in the air had become almost unbearable now, a constant thrum that seemed to press in from all sides. The figure's presence felt like a weight pressing down on everything, warping the reality around them. Mark could almost feel the ground shift beneath his feet, as though the town itself was alive and aware, listening, waiting for something to happen. Tom took a step back, his face pale, his body trembling. We need to leave," he muttered, his eyes wide with panic. "This isn't right. It's too much. We don't belong here. Whatever this is, it's not meant for us." But the figure's gaze locked onto Tom, its presence drawing closer with each passing second. Mark could see the way the figure's shape seemed to pulse, like it was drawing power from something unseen, something beneath the earth. "Leaving is not an option," the figure said, its voice filled with a terrifying calm. "You've already entered the cycle. There's no turning back." Mark's pulse quickened. The cycle, that was what the old man had warned about. That was what the girl had been so afraid of. They were caught in something far beyond their understanding, and there was no way out. The figure's words didn't just suggest danger, they declared it, with a certainty that made Mark's stomach drop. "What is this cycle?" Mark asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What do you want from us?" For a moment, the figure was silent, its shadowy form flickering again, then it spoke in a voice so soft it almost sounded like a whisper of wind. "The town was built on old foundations. Old beliefs, old power. The people who came here, they didn't just settle. They knew what they were building on. And when the time was right, the land would awaken. It was always part of the plan. You were always part of the plan." Mark felt a chill spread through him, but there was something more in the figure's words, something deeper, a connection he didn't fully understand. The town was never just a town. It had been built on something much darker, something older than its foundations. The land had been waiting, and now it was awake. And Mark and Tom were somehow tangled up in it. But there was something else. The children, the figure, they were not the only ones connected to this ancient power. Mark felt it deep inside him, a pull, a whisper, something tugging at his very core. The cycle was beginning, and it was drawing everyone in, whether they wanted to be part of it or not. "You don't know what you're dealing with," Mark said, his voice hoarse but defiant. "We won't let it happen. We won't let you use the children." The figure's form wavered, its shadow rippling, and for a moment, Mark thought he saw the faint outline of a smile. But it wasn't a comforting smile. It was cold, empty. "You can't stop it," the figure said. "The cycle has already begun. And when it's done, this town will be as it was always meant to be." Mark's mind was reeling, his heart pounding in his chest. There was so much he didn't understand, so much left to uncover. But one thing was clear, whatever was happening, it was beyond their control. The land was waking up. The cycle was beginning. And there was no escape from what was coming. The figure took another step forward, its form looming larger. "You will see," it whispered, its voice a chilling promise. "You will all see." And with that, the figure faded, slipping back into the shadows of the night as if it had never been there at all. Mark stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. The hum in the air faded, but the unease remained. The cycle had begun. And there was no turning back. The figure disappeared into the night, leaving nothing behind but the lingering chill in the air and a feeling of dread that seemed to crawl under Mark's skin. He stood in the doorway, staring out into the darkness, trying to make sense of what had just happened. His body felt heavy, like every movement was a struggle against an unseen force. The quiet hum in the air had faded, but the unease remained, suffocating, like the calm before a storm. "What now?" Tom's voice broke through the silence, his words barely audible, filled with an urgency that matched Mark's own racing thoughts. "What the hell was that thing? And what does it want with the children?" Mark couldn't answer right away. His mind was a whirlpool of questions, each one more pressing than the last. The cycle, the words echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of the ancient power that was stirring beneath their feet. The figure had spoken of a town built on old beliefs, old foundations, of something waiting to awaken. It all pointed to one inescapable truth. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than both of them. "We need to find out more," Mark finally said, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts inside his head. "The old man warned us about the cycle. We need to figure out what it is before it's too late." Tom nodded, his expression grim. They had no choice but to face whatever was coming, but every instinct in Mark screamed that they were in over their heads. They had barely scratched the surface of this mystery, and already, everything was spiraling out of control. They made their way out of the bakery, stepping into the cool night air. The town was eerily quiet, the streets empty, the only sound the distant rustle of wind through the trees. It felt wrong, like the world had stopped, as if everything was holding its breath, waiting for something. The old man's cryptic words came back to Mark, *, "You've already entered the cycle. There's no turning back." But what did that mean? How were they supposed to stop something that was so deeply ingrained in the very fabric of the town? How could they fight an ancient power that had been waiting for centuries? The walk to the woods felt longer than it should have. Every step seemed to pull them deeper into the mystery, further away from the safety of the bakery, further away from everything they knew. The street lights flickered overhead, casting long, haunting shadows across the road. Mark's breath quickened, and he could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Something was out there, something watching them from the shadows. He wasn't sure if it was the figure or something else, but he could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on him, closing in from all sides. As they neared the edge of the woods, the air grew heavier, more oppressive. The trees loomed dark and silent, their branches twisting and reaching like skeletal hands. Mark could almost hear the ground beneath them whispering, a soft hum that seemed to pulse through the earth. It was like the forest itself was alive, aware of their approach, waiting for them to cross the threshold. Tom stopped just at the edge of the woods, his body tense, eyes darting nervously around. "I don't like this," he muttered, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't think we should go any further." But Mark didn't stop. He couldn't. The figure's words were still echoing in his mind. The cycle has begun, they were already caught in it, whether they liked it or not. The only choice they had now was to see it through. "We don't have a choice," Mark said, his voice low, steady, but filled with a quiet determination. "We have to find the truth. Before it's too late." They stepped into the woods, and immediately, the air grew colder. The trees closed in around them, blocking out most of the moonlight, leaving only patches of dim, shadowed light to guide their way. The path ahead seemed endless, stretching on in all directions, twisting and winding like a labyrinth. The further they walked, the more the strange, oppressive feeling grew, until Mark felt like he couldn't breathe. A branch cracked behind them. Mark spun around, heart racing. His breath came in sharp gasps, but there was nothing there. The woods were still and silent, except for the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. But the sense of being watched didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger, more intense. They continued deeper into the woods, following a trail that seemed to beckon them forward. Mark's mind was a blur of thoughts, racing through every possibility, every danger. The hum from earlier, the figure in the doorway, the children. It was all connected, but how? What was this force that had awoken in the town, and why had it chosen now to reveal itself? Suddenly, a noise broke the silence, sharp and sudden, a child's laugh, high-pitched and chilling, echoing through the trees. Mark froze. It wasn't a sound of joy. It was something darker, something wrong. The laugh was followed by more, faint at first, then louder, until it was a chorus of children's voices, all laughing in unison. Mark's heart skipped a beat. The laughter seemed to come from all directions, swirling around them, as if the forest itself had come alive with the sound. The voices were distant but closing in, and the closer they came, the more the air seemed to hum, vibrating with a strange, unearthly energy. "Mark," Tom whispered, his voice trembling with fear. "We're not alone." Mark's eyes darted around, but he couldn't see anything through the dense darkness of the woods. The laughter grew louder, more intense. It felt like it was all around them now, pressing in from all sides, a cacophony of sound that echoed in his ears and rattled his bones. "Stay close," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper, even though he knew it wouldn't help. Whatever was out there, it wasn't afraid of them. They weren't even part of the game anymore. They were just pawns, caught in a larger scheme that was far beyond their comprehension. The ground beneath their feet seemed to shift, the earth cracking with a deep, resounding groan. Mark felt the vibrations ripple through his body, and then, without warning, the trees around them began to move. Not the branches, but the trunks themselves, swaying as if caught in some unseen wind. He could feel the darkness closing in, feel the weight of it pressing down on him, as if the entire forest was drawing in on itself. The ground shook again, and this time, Mark stumbled, barely catching himself before he fell. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the laughter stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, thick with anticipation, and Mark's heart hammered in his chest as the oppressive weight of the woods pressed closer. Something was about to happen. Something that would change everything. And they were about to find out exactly what the cycle truly meant. But would they be ready for it? Would they survive what was coming? The tension in the air was palpable, and the only thing Mark knew for sure was that there was no turning back now. The silence that followed was unbearable. It hung in the air like a thick fog, making every breath feel like an effort, every movement heavy with the weight of anticipation. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, and he could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He had no idea what was happening or what they were walking into, but the strange, menacing energy in the woods told him that whatever it was getting closer. The trees around them creaked and groaned, as though they, too, were alive in a way that was unnatural. The wind had died down, leaving the woods in a suffocating stillness. Mark strained his ears, trying to catch any sound, but the world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something. Tom was beside him, just as tense, his eyes darting around nervously. "Mark, we need to get out of here," he whispered, his voice shaky. "This isn't right. This place, it's like it's alive." Mark nodded, but deep down, he knew they couldn't leave, not yet. Whatever was happening here was bigger than them. Bigger than anything they had ever experienced. And it was clear now that the children, the 4 abandoned kids who had appeared at the bakery, were at the center of it. They were connected to this darkness, this ancient force that was awakening in the town. A faint sound broke through the heavy silence, the rustling of leaves. But it wasn't the wind. This was deliberate, almost cautious. Mark's eyes shot to the shadows between the trees, where something seemed to move just out of sight. The movement was quick, fleeting, a flash of something, or someone, but it was enough to make his pulse race. He turned to Tom, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did you see that?" Tom's eyes were wide with fear, and he nodded, barely able to speak. "Something's out there, something is watching us." Mark's throat went dry. The air had grown colder again, and now there was a sense of urgency in the way the woods seemed to pulse, as if the very land itself was reacting to their presence. The ground beneath their feet trembled slightly, almost imperceptibly, but it was enough to make Mark freeze. He could feel the energy in the air shift, a subtle hum that vibrated through the earth, running through his body like electricity. And then, just as they began to move cautiously forward, there was a noise, louder this time. A faint cry. It was distant, but unmistakable. A child's voice. It was soft at first, but it quickly grew louder, more desperate, until it felt like the very trees were echoing with it. The cry was followed by another, and then a chorus of voices, all of them pleading, all of them terrified. Mark's breath caught in his throat as the realization hit him. The voices were the children, the same ones he had seen earlier, the ones who had been abandoned in front of his bakery. But now, they were somewhere in the woods, and their cries were growing more frantic with every passing second. Without thinking, Mark grabbed Tom's arm and pulled him forward, deeper into the woods. They had to find the children. They had to get to them before whatever was happening took them completely. The forest was closing in around them, the shadows growing darker, thicker. The trees seemed to twist and bend, almost as if they were guiding them in a certain direction, pulling them towards something. Something ancient. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they were being led into a trap, but he couldn't stop. Not now. The cries of the children grew louder, more urgent, as if they were calling out to them. Mark's legs felt like lead, but he pushed forward, forcing himself to ignore the growing sense of dread gnawing at him. They were getting closer. He could feel it. Suddenly, they reached a clearing, and in the center of it stood something that stopped Mark dead in his tracks. The trees around the clearing seemed to form a perfect circle, and in the middle, there was a large stone altar. It was ancient, covered in moss and ivy, its surface worn smooth by time. But what truly caught Mark's attention were the four figures standing at the base of the altar. The children. They stood there, unmoving, their faces blank, eyes wide and empty, staring straight ahead as if in some trance. Their clothes were torn and dirty, their bodies thin and frail, but there was something about them that made Mark's blood run cold. They were different now, changed, in a way he couldn't quite explain. As Mark stepped forward, a sharp, eerie sound filled the air. It was like the cry of an animal, but distorted, almost human. The sound came from the stone altar itself, and Mark's breath caught in his throat as the surface of the altar began to shift. The stone seemed to ripple, as though it was alive, moving in waves, and a low, deep hum resonated from within it. Tom gasped beside him, his eyes wide with terror. "What is that? What's happening?" Mark didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind was racing as he watched the stone altar transform. The surface seemed to open, revealing a dark, swirling vortex beneath it. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the vortex grew larger, pulling the air around it into a violent swirl. Mark could feel the energy pulsing from it, a force so powerful that it made his skin crawl. It was like standing on the edge of something monstrous, something ancient. The children didn't move. They just stood there, their eyes fixed on the swirling darkness, as if they were waiting for something. The hum from the altar grew louder, almost deafening now, and Mark could feel it reverberating in his bones, rattling his very soul. He stepped forward, his feet barely touching the ground, drawn toward the altar, toward the vortex. But before he could move any closer, a sudden voice broke through the hum, sharp and commanding. It wasn't the figure from before, but something else, something more primal, more powerful. "You shouldn't have come," the voice said, its tone dripping with menace. "The cycle has already begun. You are too late." Mark froze. His heart skipped a beat. The voice seemed to come from everywhere, surrounding him, echoing in his mind. He turned to look for Tom, but his friend was nowhere to be seen. It was as though the forest had swallowed him whole. The vortex in the ground roared louder, and the stone altar cracked, splitting in two as if some immense force was pushing from beneath. The children didn't even flinch. They were bound to it, trapped in whatever this was, and Mark could feel himself being pulled into the same darkness. The ground beneath him began to shake violently, the trees around the clearing bending and twisting unnaturally. Something was happening, something catastrophic. And Mark had no idea how to stop it. The hum from the altar had turned into a deafening roar now, drowning out everything else. It was happening. The cycle had begun. And Mark was about to witness something that would change everything. The ground continued to shake beneath Mark's feet, each tremor sending waves of panic through his chest. He tried to move toward the altar, but it was as if the very air was pushing him back, resisting his every step. The swirling vortex beneath the stone seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, drawing everything toward it, like a magnet pulling in metal, relentless and unforgiving. The hum grew louder, a maddening sound that made his teeth ache and his bones vibrate. It felt like the very essence of the forest was turning against him. Mark's mind raced, scrambling for a solution, but the overwhelming force around him made it impossible to think clearly. The children stood motionless, their eyes still blank, their bodies unyielding, as though they had no agency at all. It was as if the altar had claimed them, and in that moment, Mark realized just how powerless they all were. The cycle, whatever it was not something they could stop, not unless they understood it, truly understood the ancient force that was awakening in this very place. A sharp crack pierced through the air, and the altar splintered further, its surface cracking wide open. Mark stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. The ground beneath his feet seemed to buckle and shift, as if some deep force was pulling it downward, into the darkness. He tried to shout, to call out to the children, but his voice was swallowed by the roar of the vortex. It was as if the whole world had descended into chaos, everything blending into one deafening, oppressive sound. And then, through the swirling madness, Mark saw it, something so impossible, so unfathomable, that for a moment, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. From the depths of the vortex, a figure emerged. But it wasn't the figure he had encountered earlier. This one was different, taller, more imposing, with a presence so overwhelming that it felt like the very air around it bowed in submission. Its features were shrouded in darkness, but Mark could make out enough to see the long, flowing cloak that seemed to ripple like liquid, shifting in the windless air. Its eyes glowed a faint, sickly green, and its voice, when it spoke, echoed in Mark's mind, rather than his ears. Asterisk, you thought you could stop it. Asterisk, the voice sent a cold shiver down Mark's spine, its tone impossibly ancient, filled with malice and contempt. The figure stepped forward, the ground seemingly parting before it. It was as if the vortex was feeding off its presence, growing larger, more powerful with every passing second. Mark's legs weakened, his body trembling with fear. "Who are you?" he managed to gasp, his voice barely audible over the swirling chaos. His mind was spinning, trying to grasp the enormity of the situation. This was no ordinary entity, it was something far older, something far darker. The figure's laugh filled the air, cruel and hollow. "I am the keeper of the cycle. I am its guardian. And you," it paused, its eyes narrowing with disdain. "You are a mere interruption." Mark's stomach churned. This wasn't just an ancient power they were up against. It was a force that had been guarding something, something so dangerous that it had been kept hidden, buried, for centuries. The cycle had never been meant to be broken. It was a constant, a force of nature, and Mark and Tom had stumbled into it by accident. As the figure moved forward, the ground cracked open, revealing dark, writhing tendrils that reached out like grasping hands. The earth seemed to come alive with an insidious energy, and Mark's chest tightened in panic as he realized that it wasn't just the altar or the children that were caught in this. It was the entire town, the entire land, all bound by the cycle. "We're too late," Mark whispered, more to himself than anyone else. But before he could process the thought, another shockwave of energy erupted from the vortex, knocking him off his feet. He crashed to the ground, the air around him crackling with electricity. For a moment, he couldn't breathe, couldn't think, his vision blurred, and he could hear nothing but the roar of the vortex and the pounding of his heart in his ears. And then, just as quickly, everything stopped. Mark gasped for air, his lungs burning as he slowly sat up. The forest around him had fallen completely silent. Even the wind had stilled, leaving an unnatural quiet in its wake. He looked around, his heart racing as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. The figure was still there, its form standing tall and unwavering in the center of the clearing, but there was something different now, something that had shifted in the air, something that felt more dangerous, more real than before. Mark's eyes darted to the children. They hadn't moved, but something was changing. Their eyes, once vacant, began to glow with the same eerie green light that now emanated from the figure. They were waking up, or maybe they had never truly been asleep. It was as if they were being drawn into the cycle, their bodies no longer their own. They were becoming part of it, part of the force that had been unleashed. Mark tried to stand, but his legs felt weak, and his body trembled with the overwhelming weight of what was happening. The ground beneath him began to shift again, but this time it wasn't just a tremor. The very earth seemed to rise up, buckling and twisting in unnatural ways. The trees groaned, their trunks contorting, and the sky above darkened, swirling with storm clouds that seemed to come from nowhere. The figure's voice echoed through the clearing once more. "The cycle is inevitable. You have no power here, no control. You are but a fleeting moment in its endless span." Mark clenched his fists, his mind racing. There had to be a way to stop this. He couldn't let it end like this, couldn't let whatever was coming swallow them all. But as he looked at the figure, at the children, at the vortex, he felt a sense of hopelessness creep into his chest. The stakes had never been higher. The town, the children, and possibly even the world were on the brink of being consumed by something far beyond their understanding. Mark knew they had only moments left before it was too late, before the cycle completed itself. But the question that kept echoing in his mind was whether they could stop it at all, or if they were merely pawns in a game that had already been set in motion long before they arrived. The figure raised its hand, and Mark's heart stopped as the ground beneath him began to shake violently. The tendrils from the earth stretched higher, and the vortex opened wider, threatening to consume everything in its path. The forest was no longer a sanctuary, it was part of the storm, part of the force that was growing, unstoppable. Mark took one last look at the children, their glowing eyes now locked on him, and the realization hit him like a bolt of lightning. The cycle was not just about the town. It was about them. About him. They had been chosen. And now, there was no turning back. Mark's chest heaved as he struggled to regain his bearings. The air was thick, suffocating, swirling with a dark energy he could barely comprehend. The vortex spun wider, the ground around him continuing to rumble violently, threatening to pull everything into its depths. He stared at the children, their eyes glowing with that sickly green light, and then to the figure standing at the center of it all, so powerful, so imposing. It was clear now that there was no escaping it. The figure's voice echoed again, its tone laced with cold certainty. "This is the end, Mark. The cycle is complete. There's nothing you can do to stop it now." Mark's mind raced. He couldn't let that be true. There had to be a way to stop this madness, a way to save the children, and to save everything that was about to be consumed by the growing storm. He couldn't stand by and watch as this ancient force swallowed the town whole, leaving nothing but ashes behind. Suddenly, a flash of clarity hit him. A thought so sharp, so direct, that it almost knocked the breath from his lungs. It wasn't about stopping the cycle, it was about controlling it. The children weren't just passive vessels, they were the key. Their connection to the cycle wasn't just that they were being drawn in, they were tied to it, yes, but they were also the ones who could disrupt it, reverse it. It was all about breaking the chain. Breaking the link between them and the force that had been feeding on their lives. Mark's eyes darted around the clearing, his heart hammering. In his chest. He looked back at the altar, where the vortex was now swirling with furious intensity, and then at the children, standing motionless, their blank expressions locked in place. He felt the presence of the ancient force in every fiber of his being. It was powerful, yes, but there was something vulnerable about it too, something that could be disrupted, if only he could figure out how. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, fighting against the weight of the energy around him. His legs were shaky, but he forced himself to keep moving, toward the children. His mind raced with the only plan he could think of, touching them, connecting with them, breaking the link that had drawn them into the cycle. But as he reached the first child, his hand hovered inches away from her pale, glowing skin. He felt a surge of resistance, an invisible wall that pushed back, as if the air itself didn't want him to make contact. Mark's heart raced. There was no time. He couldn't wait any longer. He had to act now. He closed his eyes and reached out, his hand landing firmly on the child's shoulder. The moment his skin made contact with hers, a shock of energy ran through him, a bolt of raw power, like nothing he had ever felt before. His vision blurred as the force surged through him, wrapping around him like chains, trying to pull him into the vortex. But Mark fought back. He focused on the children's faces, their blank expressions slowly shifting as they began to twitch, their eyes flickering with signs of life. Slowly, the vortex began to waver, its violent spinning faltering just for a moment. It was enough. He reached for the next child, and the same thing happened, an electric jolt that shot through his body, but this time he was ready for it. He fought the pull, his mind focused on the task at hand. The cycle was a loop, and they were caught in it, but they could break it. He could break it. Mark's grip tightened, and slowly, one by one, he made contact with each child, holding onto them with every ounce of strength he had. With each touch, the vortex's power began to flicker, its violent spinning lessening as though something was disrupting its flow. The ground trembled less, the trees stopped groaning, and the oppressive atmosphere that had been choking the life out of the forest started to ease. It wasn't enough yet, but Mark could feel it, he was getting through. The children were waking up. But just as hope began to rise, the figure's deep, echoing voice cut through the air once again, colder than before. "You think you can control it?" the voice hissed. "You think you can break the cycle that has ruled this land for centuries?" Mark's heart clenched. He knew the figure was powerful, but it had underestimated him. He had underestimated the power of human will, of connection, of a simple touch that could change everything. The children weren't just conduits for the force, they were the ones who could fight it. And in this moment, Mark was fighting for them, and for himself. As he reached out to the last child, something shifted. The figure's form flickered, momentarily losing its solid shape, like a mirage that couldn't hold its ground. Mark's chest tightened, his instincts screaming at him that something was about to change, something critical. The figure lunged forward, its hand reaching out toward him. The air snapped with a terrifying energy as the figure's form blurred, shifting and distorting. Mark's vision spun, but before the figure could strike, the ground beneath them shook with such force that it seemed as though the very earth was breaking apart. Suddenly, the children's eyes snapped open, all of them, at once. And the light that filled their gaze wasn't the sickly green of the cycle, it was bright, pure, and powerful. It burned through the darkness, shattering it like glass. The figure's form writhed, its screams echoing through the clearing as it was sucked into the vortex, unable to fight against the force that had been awakened in the children. The stone altar cracked and splintered as the energy surged outward, and with one final, blinding flash, the vortex imploded, collapsing in on itself. Mark was thrown back, landing hard on the ground, his body bruised and battered. The clearing was silent, the chaos gone, leaving behind only the soft rustle of the wind. Slowly, he pushed himself to his feet, his breath ragged as he looked around. The children stood in front of him, no longer glowing, their eyes now clear and calm. The oppressive energy had lifted, and the woods, though still wild and untamed, no longer felt suffocating. But just as Mark thought it was over, something unexpected happened. The children turned to him, their faces now filled with sadness, an emotion he hadn't expected to see. They didn't speak, but there was a heaviness in the air that wasn't there before. And then, one of the children, the youngest, looked up at Mark with eyes full of sorrow and whispered in a voice that seemed far older than her years. "You should never have interfered. It was always meant to happen this way." Mark froze. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. The cycle had never truly been broken. He had disrupted it, yes, but in doing so, he had set something else into motion, something even darker, even more dangerous. The children weren't just victims of the cycle. They were its guardians. And now, with the cycle disrupted, they had become something else entirely. Something even more powerful than before. The town had been saved. But at what cost? Mark took a step back, his mind reeling. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Mark stood frozen in place, the weight of the child's words sinking deep into his chest. He had thought he was saving them, saving the town, by breaking the cycle. But now, the true meaning of what he had done began to unfurl in his mind. The children weren't victims of the cycle. They were its guardians, its keepers. And by severing their connection to it, he had unleashed something far more dangerous. The very thing he had fought so hard to prevent was now beginning to stir in the depths of the forest, in the shadows of the trees, in the corners of his mind. The youngest child, her face a mixture of sadness and wisdom beyond her years, reached out a small hand toward him. Mark hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. What had he done? Had his interference been a mistake? Her eyes locked onto his, and she spoke again, this time with a soft urgency that carried weight. The cycle was a balance, Mark. A protection. The forest, the land, the town, they all depended on it. By breaking it, you've allowed the force to be freed, and now it will grow stronger. The balance will tip in its favor. Mark's stomach twisted, his mind racing. He had always known something dark lived in the woods, something ancient and malevolent, but he had believed that the altar and the children were the source of that evil. Now, he understood the truth. The children weren't merely being consumed by the cycle, they had been the cycle's stewards, keeping the balance intact. The forest itself had been watching, waiting. And now, with the balance disturbed, it would begin to reclaim what it had lost. The wind picked up, rustling the branches of the trees, and Mark could feel the weight of the ancient force bearing down on him once more. The town was no longer safe. Nothing was. What do I do? Mark asked, desperation creeping into his voice. How do I fix this? How do I stop it? The child didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned her gaze to the other children, who were still standing motionless, their eyes now clouded with something Mark couldn't quite read. A moment passed before she turned back to him, her voice quiet but filled with a strange, quiet certainty. "You can't undo what's been done. But you can restore the balance," she said. "You must find the heart of the forest. The source. It's where everything began." Mark's breath caught in his throat. The heart of the forest. The legends he had heard as a child, the old stories of the sacred grove hidden deep within the woods, the place where the earth's power was strongest. He had thought it was a myth, a story to scare children into staying away. But now, he understood. The heart of the forest wasn't a legend. It was real. And it was the key to everything. The child's words burned in his mind. "Find the heart, Mark. And stop the force before it consumes everything." Without another word, the children turned and began walking away, their pale forms fading into the shadows of the trees. Mark didn't know what to think, only that time was running out. The forest was already shifting, changing around him, as if it knew the balance had been disrupted. He had no choice but to follow their instructions. With a sense of urgency gripping his chest, Mark sprinted through the forest, the twisted trees closing in around him. The air felt different now, thick with an unseen pressure, as if the forest itself was alive and aware of his every movement. The further he went, the more it seemed to shift, roots reaching out to trip him, branches swaying unnaturally, as if trying to warn him to turn back. But Mark didn't stop. He couldn't afford to. Hours passed, or maybe it was days, it was hard to tell in the disorienting maze of trees and shadows. The forest seemed to warp and bend around him, its pulse like the beating of a heart, slow but relentless. He felt as if he were walking through a dream, caught in an inescapable loop of dread and confusion. But still, he pushed forward, clinging to the hope that there was something, somewhere, that could bring the balance back. Finally, just as he thought he couldn't take another step, he saw it. The clearing. The heart of the forest. It was more beautiful than anything he could have imagined. In the center of the clearing stood a massive tree, its trunk so wide that Mark could barely wrap his arms around it. Its roots stretched deep into the earth, its branches reaching high into the sky, with leaves that shimmered in an ethereal light. There was an ancient energy here, a force that resonated in every part of Mark's being. It was both terrifying and awe-inspiring, the kind of power that humbles and destroys in equal measure. But it wasn't just the tree that caught his attention. Beneath its vast canopy, in the center of the clearing, lay a stone altar, much like the one he had seen before. But this one was different. It pulsed with a faint glow, an energy Mark could feel thrumming beneath his feet. This was the source. This was the heart of the cycle. As Mark approached, the ground beneath him began to tremble, the air crackling with the same ominous energy he had felt when the vortex first began to form. He could feel the force, the ancient power, rising again, its hunger growing stronger with every passing second. He didn't have time to hesitate. Mark dropped to his knees before the altar, his hands trembling as he pressed them against the cool stone. He whispered a prayer, he wasn't sure to whom or what, but he knew that this was his last chance. And then, just as the energy reached its peak, a voice spoke. But it wasn't the same voice as before. It was softer, gentler, as if the forest itself was speaking to him. "You cannot undo what has been done. But you can restore the balance." Mark nodded, understanding at last. The children had been right. The cycle wasn't something to destroy, it was something to be maintained. The heart of the forest was the key, the anchor that held everything together. If he could restore the cycle, if he could reconnect the children, the balance could be preserved. With a deep breath, Mark closed his eyes and let the energy flow through him. He felt the connection, felt the cycle beginning to form again, but this time, it was different. This time, it wasn't an ancient force pulling him in, it was his choice, his will. Slowly, the tremors subsided, the pressure lifted. The forest began to settle, the air growing still and calm once more. When Mark opened his eyes, the heart of the forest was at peace. The darkness was gone. He didn't know what the future would hold, but for now, the cycle had been restored. And with it, a fragile hope for balance. The town was safe. The children, though forever changed, had been spared. And as Mark made his way back through the forest, he understood one thing above all: some forces are not meant to be fought, but understood. Some cycles, once broken, cannot be repaired, but perhaps, just perhaps, they can be rewritten.